Hi, I'm Max Keiser. Welcome to the Keiser Report. You know, when plunder becomes a way of life for a group of men in a society, over the course of time, they create for themselves a banking system that facilitates it and a monetary system that aids and abets it. There are, however, not enough gulags in the world to hold back the masses who may one day wake up and take it all back. Wow, I'm inspired. Stacy.
It sounds like Bastiat.
It's Frederick Bastiat.
Not the painter.
No, not the painter that was hanging about with Andy Warhol and then suddenly overdosed and sold his works posthumously in the tens of millions of dollars. No, this is the pauper, Frederick Bastiat from the 1800s. Who wrote a lot of cool stuff, I believe, in the 1800s.
The painter is Basquiat.
Yeah, Basquiat, yes.
Anyway, so I want to look at plunder, both outright and not so obvious, and how it might cause quite a lot of disruption and perhaps revolution around the world. And first, I want to look at a new kind of aspiring member of the European Union. Moldova banking scandal fuels biggest protest ever. And that's biggest protest ever, even those that happened against communism, so that when they overthrew their communist government. Here, tens of thousands of Moldovans rallied on September 6th in the heart of the capital, Chisinau, in the biggest street protest in memory, demanding the resignation of the president and early elections over a $1 billion bank fraud that has hit living standards. The protesters streamed into the capital from all regions of the small, largely rural ex-Soviet state in answer to an appeal by a new mass organization called DA to demonstrate in a central square outside the main government building. The government that stole this is noted as being very pro-European, and the previous governments are also pro-Western. And here they have apparently, it looks like on the surface, stolen $1 billion, which is about 1/6 of the economy. They stole it out of the economy, and the people want it back.
Who's that economist in New Zealand? He's got a similar name.
I don't know who that is, but this story, the movement in Moldova is called DA. And here it reminds me, however, they're saying like, oh, this is a shock because this guy is pro-European. But if you look at Iceland, if you look at Ireland, it's a very similar story. Is billions and billions and billions of dollars were plundered from the people, essentially from the banking system, over which the people ultimately had to pay. They plundered the banking systems there, even though they were part of the EU or pro-EU.
Well, the way the banking system is set up now, it becomes easier and easier to steal. High-frequency trading is a good example. That you put a server next to a stock exchange and you siphon money off. And the high-frequency trading firms, they make money every single day with no risk. So that's just outright stealing. Here you have another example of stealing. Iceland was stealing. So when you just plug in an algorithm or software into a big cache of money and you suck it all out, that's what you do. You plunder. You take it all. And
but at least these people have the pride to ask for it back. In fact, one of their chants is that they say, "Victory, bring the $1 billion back home." So at least when the high-frequency traders are scooping out, they're sucking out pennies on every single trade on transactions. They're looting the system, i.e. pension funds and other passive investors of billions of dollars a year. Nobody's asking for that back. They're just meekly asking, please, Federal Reserve, please don't raise interest rates because then I could pay off some of the interest on the debt that I've accumulated because these people have plundered and destroyed the system. They're meekly asking for more, food stamps or anything to just get them through the day. At least these people are out there demanding some of the money back because the theft is obvious and they understand it.
Right. The low interest rates, it's a good point there. Not only is it easier to steal money with low rates, but it's also bankrupts society with their savings, so they end up becoming quite passive and appealing to the state for more assistance, more state subsidies, having had their savings stolen through these financial means, and instead of actually going after those who did the stealing. Which is a sad break. But yes, it's good to see that people are standing up and saying, hey, we just had $1 billion stolen. We'd like that money back, please.
Look at what happens when there's an immediate, obvious plunder, which is very small in relative, in terms of the amount stolen, but relative to the economy, it's quite large. But if you compare it to what has gone on in the West, in the bigger economies, you have the same situation as what you see here. The fraud has caused a rapid depreciation in the national currency, the leu, stoking inflation and hurting living standards. This is one of the issues we see in elections in the US and the UK over the past few years, is this notion of living standards. Or in France, people keep on talking about our declining living standards. And we must ask ourselves, is this because of the plunder through low interest rates, through all the fraud that was, like in the case of Ireland, for example, the Anglo-Irish debts were transferred to the population without any sort of seeming protest. But are their living standards, do they look around and see that their living standards are caused by that? And here we see that it has also tarnished the image of the pro-Europe ruling class for ordinary Moldovans, many of whom struggle to get by on a family income of about $300 a month, though many protesters carried pro-EU flags, indicating that they were not against the country's policy of European integration. So it's quite interesting, because it does seem that we're at that everybody has often said, like, this is, I guess, the least worst policy. It's like, well, okay, this is a better way to be defrauded, I guess, than some other, if somebody waving another flag of ideology.
Yeah, so that's the end up with a choice of how do you want to be defrauded? Which way of being defrauded suits you?
At least in a casino, there's a little bit of fun. There's some free drinks. There's, you don't have to work as hard. You don't have to pretend to go to a job at a factory and all that stuff.
Well, in a casino, there is a chance you might win.
Yeah.
And here, there is no chance. It's zero chance.
So, well, there is a chance in the UK, because there are quite a few lottery winners. There's now something like, I think they said 700,000 property millionaires. So let's look at another situation, which, I'm not saying it's any sort of dodgy thing, but it could look to some people pretty dodgy. Barratt profits surge thanks to housing shortage and Help to Buy scheme. UK's largest home builder to make more than £560 million as a result of government policy for first-time buyers and rising house prices. Britain's largest home builder, Barratt Developments, has reported a 45% surge in profits as a result of the acute mismatch between housing demand and supply, as well as the government's Help to Buy scheme. So, £560 million, about $900 million, maybe not as much as the $1 billion taken from the Moldovan economy. But, one could suggest if the government policy is aiding these people to make this sort of profit, they themselves admit it in their own results. It can on the surface seem a little bit dodgy, but in the casino, that enough people are winning on house price rises, they might tolerate it for longer.
Well, this is interesting because the government is against giving a subsidy for public housing. So instead, they've organized, which would have benefited hundreds of thousands of people. So instead, they've organized a government-sanctioned subsidy for a housing developer, which benefits 5 or 6 people at the top of that organization. So instead of a government subsidy to help hundreds of thousands of British people with housing assistance, they've said, no, we're going to take all that away from you, and we're going to package it up as a Help to Buy scheme, as a government subsidy, and we're going to give close to $1 billion to a few executives at this company instead. That's our plan.
Yeah. And in fact, we'll go into the details of how much those executives had made. And many people at the time called it the Help to Sell scheme, not the Help to Buy. And this suggests that it could be true. Now, when the government announced that policy, Help to Buy, they said it was in order to help first-time home buyers. Well, according to the article, the government Help to Buy scheme, which was unveiled in the 2013 budget, allows home buyers with just 5% of a property price to buy a new build home with the help of an interest-free loan or an existing home with a government-guaranteed mortgage. The scheme has been extended to 2020. Very few first-time buyers, however, have benefited, partly because the scheme has helped to drive up prices. But the scheme has been a boon for housing companies, which have seen an upswing in profits against a backdrop of intense demand for housing and record low interest rates. The previous chief executive of Barratt Developments, this company that has benefited with their profits are up 45% on the past year since the introduction of Help to Buy. Mark Clare, he cashed in £11.8 million worth of shares when he stepped down in July after 9 years at the top. He received £1.03 million in pay and bonuses last year, thanks to £4.1 million payments from a long-term incentive scheme.
Right, that's a government subsidy given to one guy instead of given to thousands of people. So it's just a financial engineering, as we've been talking about, to disenfranchise many who are not going to support the banking system as such. You know, if you give a subsidy to someone on public housing, they're going to spend that money growing the economy. They're going to spend it on food. They're going to spend it on shelter. They're going to spend it on clothing. That doesn't help anybody who's in the kleptocracy. If you give the same amount of a government subsidy to a few guys at the top and then they support the wars, they support the monoculture in the media landscape, they support everything the government is doing, you get some bang for the buck. So the problem is that the poor people are not being subservient enough to warrant the subsidy, so that's been given to those who have demonstrated obedience.
So how to paint these sort of situations differently? In Moldova, they just took the $1 billion and ran. But they painted it in a kind of way of like Iceland and Ireland and said, oh, it was just like bad loans that went bad. We didn't steal it and that sort of stuff. Now, in this article, they point out that it didn't help first-time home buyers. And that links back to a story from June of this year. And it says, Help to Buy helps lock out first-time buyers. After helping initially, the government scheme's impact on house prices means current would-be buyers are no longer able to afford homes. The government's flagship Help to Buy scheme has provided only temporary help to first-time buyers and locked out other would-be home buyers out of the market, a housing economist said. And we talked about the casino aspect of this. But while a lucky few first-time buyers have benefited, said Matthew Poynton, property economist at Capital Economics, the impact on house prices means others are no longer able to afford homes. So the Help to Buy scheme was just temporary, and it actually caused a lot more losers than there have been winners. And this is the fragile equation, the algorithm, if you want, of running your economy on this algo, that it could, if you have too many losers, it could become a Moldovan situation,
Yes, it could become a Moldovan moment. Stacey, we look forward to seeing that moment realize itself as a result of this misplaced subsidy creating an entrenched kleptocracy. Thank you.
Duh.
Well, that's fantastic, isn't it? Thank you. Well, stay tuned for the second half. I'll have Ned Naylor Leyland with a whole lot more. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. You know, it's time once again to turn to Ned Naylor Leyland of Old Mutual Global Investors. Ned, welcome back.
Thank you, Max.
So, Ned, we're talking about gold, and I wanted to return briefly to this concept of flow, because it seems to be a word where a lot of things pivot around this idea of flow. Mm-hmm. And I think for the general audience, it's a bit of a rabbit hole. Once you say flow, they just kind of like disappear into this rabbit hole of assumptions and a lot of jargon and stuff. And it relates to this fractional reserve gold model that you've talked about, the fact that there's only 1% of the gold market is physical gold in the world. You know, if I gave you a gold sovereign, if there's BRICS trading hands, it's only 1% of the total dollar volume of gold in the world, because all the other dollar volume is based on futures contracts and paper and all this other stuff. Mm-hmm. But it pivots on this idea of flow. So once again, if you could walk us through what you mean by that.
Well, I think that what we're really getting at here is the fact that, the LBMA itself said that they think that all the gold in London represents around 200, I can't remember the exact numbers, $250 billion in value, which happens to be very similar to the average daily turnover of the London Bullion Market Association.
Okay, that's a good point. So you got this number that they say, 250 billion, is equivalent to the daily average turnover
of the gold market.
Right.
So this gives one a good sense and a good, I think actually I'll be slightly qualified by saying I'm pretty sure that in the last 6 months, actually, average daily turnover has dropped off quite markedly, but it's still a very, very, very large number relative to the amount the LBMA says is in good delivery form within the banking system.
So this turnover is flow.
Yes.
Essentially.
Yes.
It's the turnover, or I mean, that's just it's almost synonymous, but not quite. But in financial circles, you could say, the volume, the turnover, the flow of gold contracts, gold that's being traded, is it's a good bullet point there. It's if that's the actual gold in the bank, and they do that every single day, it gives you an idea that there's trading a lot more than what's in the actual bank. So let's turn to we're going to leave that now. Okay. So let's turn to interest rates. There's been talk in the United States about they're going to raise rates. They keep putting it forward. It seems that in this type of environment or flow, the flow is financed by cheap money. If they raise rates, the flow goes belly up, right?
Well, I mean, look, I would fall in line with your comment about you can't taper a Ponzi, Max. I mean, look, ever since the first inkling of rate rises came about, which is 3 years ago now, I mean, I was just blown away by the fact that anybody could even imagine.
Okay, let me stop
happen.
you there for a second, because the idea is that if they raise rates, it strengthens the dollar, and gold would be cheaper. They've done the same con for 3 years. They keep saying we're going to raise rates.
Yeah.
And therefore the dollar would be supported, and so gold is on the back foot. But how come the gold market hasn't figured out yet that that's a complete con? And they just say, you know what, just buy gold. Those guys are jokers.
Okay, because this comes back to this issue of what moves the price of gold. So what moves the price of gold is the flow of money in the over-the-counter, primarily FX market. So the guys that are looking at that and have these huge amounts of capital to invest, they're looking at this and they're saying, what is the opportunity cost of owning gold as a currency? Now, when you mention the dollar there, I'm not sure I quite agree with that. I think it's more to do with the expectation of return on relatively short-dated US-denominated paper. So when these guys are looking at the bond market and they're hearing the central bankers dingling the bell, like Pavlov with his dog, if that means the market then reacts anticipating higher yields, they're not going to want to own gold. So when you say dollar up, gold down, it doesn't necessarily work like that. Because if there was an event whereby markets roiled and everyone felt they had to flee into the dollar as a safe haven, in fact, actually that's more likely to have the effect of depressing yields in US paper, which in my view would be more likely to drive the gold price up, because the big investors will look at gold on a relative basis and say, no return, that's okay, because yields in my relative choice are coming down. So unfortunately, for the person who's really interested in gold as a structural hedge, for the time being, that is the real driver of price change. And it's been very frustrating watching the bell be dingled solidly for 3 years, knowing full well it was never going to be delivered. The food was never going to be delivered to the dog. We could see that, but the dog kept dribbling. And that's part of the nature, the short-term nature of the way people trade markets as well. But I would be cautious about identifying dollar up, gold down, or vice versa, because it's more about the expectation of return on a cash proxy, if that makes sense.
Okay, so if that's the case, and you're saying that, well, if they're going to raise rates and I'm going to get a return on a 5-year note or a 10-year note versus nothing on gold, I'm going to go into bonds, into these notes or bonds.
Yes.
And so I'm pulling money out of gold, or I'm not going to be in gold. Okay, you're creating a dynamic there.
You are, but remember that this is not bearing in mind the capital flight argument, Max, because if there's a big rush of cash, of flight into the dollar, and they're not going to be willing to hold just raw dollars, they're going to be looking for a way of holding dollars with a return, that will actually have the effect of depressing the yield, because the prices will go up, the yields will go down, and that's actually good for gold, not bad. So
right,
it's a complex dynamic.
I understand that bit, but I'm just saying, so what? But then why wouldn't why are the bond holders, I guess, doesn't matter if they're fooled or not, because they're just looking on a day-to-day basis.
Pretty much, yeah. They're trading against each other. The end game, which is what we're focusing on, isn't necessarily of any interest to these
Okay,
people.
so this brings up an interesting point. So you're saying in this highly leveraged world of financialization, where you've got markets trading at 100 to 1, 200 to 1, possibly, the bulk of the control of the price discovery mechanism is in the hands of very short-term traders with huge accounts that are only looking on the horizon of the next 6 to 9 hours, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, potentially slightly longer than that. Some of them will be 6 to 9 hours. Some of them will be a little bit longer, but they're certainly not thinking about the end game of the fiat of the reserve currency system, which of course is apparent. I mean,
Right,
if
so
you
they
pause
have
and step back, that's very obvious.
They have no incentive to think of their consequences
They have
beyond.
a disincentive.
Let's say they have a
They have an
disincentive.
active disincentive. It is against their interests in terms of them handing their book over to their line manager in paying any attention to this.
So the bulk of the money in the price discovery for the fundamental price that controls the global economy, interest rates, is in the hands of people who are disincentivized to give a flying hoot.
Or to pay attention to signals.
To pay attention to the signals that would that are flashing in ways that would be obvious or are obvious to yourself and others, but it's not something that needs to be taken on board in terms of performance over the next 2 or 3 days, or maybe the next 3 months at most, the next quarter.
Yeah, because the market works like a pack, doesn't it? I mean, the way we see things would certainly be the absolute outlier of the entire herd, whereas most people are interested in how they're positioned relative to the person nestling against them, and it just means that they're not thinking about either long-term cyclical things or the nature of money or any of these more interesting subjects which ought to be being more actively debated at the
So you
moment.
have a pack of wolves, and they've got a dead carcass in the snow called the global economy, and they're just trying to survive by ravaging it and elbowing out their fellow wolf.
I think that would be an interesting analogy, probably more based on management than the underlying traders, but it's a good one all the same.
Okay, let's go over to China for a second. It's launching an oil exchange priced oil in yuan. Now, your thoughts on how this will impact the dollar's lifespan and indeed how it will affect monetary policy at the Fed. So this is, again, this theme of China divorcing itself from the dollar, working with other Asian countries to do so. What's going on there?
Well, look, I think it's a natural step further to that huge gas deal between Russia and China, which I think was probably the bigger geopolitical
$400
event.
billion deal, I believe.
Absolutely huge, but it's not just so much in terms of the numbers. It's the geopolitical implication of if not openly stating it, being quite clear that the dollar's role, the petrodollar's role, is now, if not defunct, it is on the way out. And the realpolitik of Asia is that they are now dealing with cross-border flows, their own currencies, and I suppose the question is, how does this selling of dollars that we discussed before by Asian countries impact the petrodollar system in the short term? Medium term, I think this is just another step on the road to a new reserve currency system of some form.
Okay, let's skip ahead to you're on a roll, Ned. You're on a roll. Let's continue spanning the globe. Let's go to Japan. Okay, stock markets last week soared 8% on hopes of more cheap money, quantitative easing, and other stimulus, monetary fiscal stimulus. So first of all, why isn't gold doing better in that? I think I know the answer. And it seems like Japan is entering into a spasmodic endgame of utter collapse. But what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think Japan is fascinating, but also quite difficult to understand. I mean, I'm no Japan specialist, Max, but obviously they've been dealing with structural monetary system problems for longer than anyone else. And I suppose on that basis, it wouldn't be unreasonable to expect serious problems to emanate there before elsewhere.
Has the Nikkei topped out from its low? In 1989, it hit a peak of 40,000, then it dropped to 8,000. Then the various programs kicked in, then Abenomics, they got it up to 20,000. Seems like it's hitting a ceiling there. You think it might have topped out?
I think it's unlikely. Well, I just think that, we're in a scenario where unless they're going to completely back off on what they've said, which would be incredibly dangerous on a deflationary level, they're more likely to keep throwing fresh stimulus and effectively liquidity at their own system, which one would imagine would tend to drive equity market there higher.
So for every time they put in these fresh stimulus systems, they need to create or expand the paper flow around gold to keep it suppressed, essentially. Because if they let gold price pop up, it's like the jig's up.
I think that's true, but I don't think Japanese aren't big on saving in physical gold, and even if they were, does that affect price discovery as we've discussed? So I'm not sure that the gold market in a physical sense in Japan has any real meaning. I do think though that if you look at the correlation between the dollar and the yen and the gold price, there appears to be some important algorithmic overlay there, which may or may not impact the gold price going forward should the yen move aggressively in either direction.
Right, Mrs. Watanabe is not a big gold buyer, so that has no influence. But let me just jump forward. So we have about 20 seconds left on the Brexit. Society Generale is a huge unpriced risk to financial stability. Markets are ignoring the risk. Your thoughts? We've got about 20 seconds.
I think that the powers that be in the UK are well capable of moving the public towards the outcome they wish for, and that would probably be a reason why the expectation is that it won't happen.
Fair enough. All right. Ned Naylor, Leyland, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
My pleasure, Max.
And that's going to do it for this episode of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Ned Naylor, Leyland of Old Mutual Global Investors. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time. Bye, y'all.